How to build a brain. The difference between building and growing brains. Humans like to build things. We're pretty good at it too. Give us some materials and a bit of time and effort and the right kind of information, and we can build just about anything. It's that last part, the right kind of information, that might be doing more than we often give it credit for. If we want to build a house, we find what we need in a blueprint. If we are building a bookcase, we follow the IKEA manual. With step-by-step instructions and a little patience, we eventually end up with a functional-ish place to store our unread novels. We build shelves, sheds, bookcases, and bridges using this kind of information, the kind we find in blueprints and manuals. But what if we want to build a brain? It's not a bookshelf, but it's something that thinks, learns, and maybe even understands. Whether we're building a biological brain or an artificial one, is this the kind of information we need? A blueprint or a manual? When we think about how life is built, it can seem like a similar process. We need good materials, some time and effort, and the right kind of information. So what is the right kind of information for life? It's DNA, right? DNA is often described as life's instruction manual, and if that's true, then maybe building a brain isn't so different from building a building. But here is the thing. We don't usually say that we build life. We say that life grows. There seems to be a line, a difference, between what we build and what we grow. Is that just semantics? Are we just using different words for the animate and the inanimate? Or are there real differences between building something and growing something? And now us humans are trying to build artificial brains, machines that can think, reason, learn, and maybe even understand the world the way we do. And it turns out we're pretty good at that too. We've built algorithms that can solve problems, mimic conversations, and beat us at our own games. We talk about it like an engineering challenge. With good materials, a bunch of time and effort, and the right kind of information, we can build an artificial brain. And whatever line there might be between what we build and what we grow is starting to blur. So we might want to know, what is the difference between building a brain and growing one? Is there a difference? And if there is, does it matter? This week, we're asking 3 questions. 1, what is the difference between building and growing? 2, how does complexity grow? And 3, what does it mean to grow a brain? Question 1, what is the difference between building and growing? Let's start by looking at something much simpler than a brain. Not a living system, not even an artificial intelligence, just a tiny computer program made of black and white squares. If you've been around this newsletter for a while, you have probably heard me mention cellular automata before, like Rule 110. If you are new here and you want a quick overview, I have included a link in the essay. Cellular automata are simple computer programs that follow basic rules. They start with a straightforward set of instructions that determine whether each cell in a grid turns on, black, turns off, white, or stays the same. And this is based on the state of its neighbours. And that's it. The set of instructions are incredibly simple. But sometimes those instructions, when left to run long enough, can produce astonishingly complex patterns. The rules for Rule 110 contain some kind of information. They tell the system how to behave. But what kind of information is that? Is it more like a blueprint, or is it more like DNA? Do we build the outcome, or do we grow it? It is a little bit like a blueprint. The rules are fixed. The same starting point will always produce the same result. But there's a key difference. A blueprint tells you what the final structure will be before you begin building. Rule 10 doesn't do that. With a blueprint, we can read its instructions and know what we will build. The only way to find out what a cellular automation will produce is to run the program. In that way, the rules for Rule 110 are more like DNA. They're a short sequence of code that doesn't spell out the final form, but guides a process that unfolds over time. So, what's the difference between building and growing? It might come down to this. Building is plan-driven. You know what you're aiming for. Growing is process-driven. You have to let it unfold. Question 2. How does complexity grow? The complexity that Rule 110 creates can't be found in the set of instructions. For things that grow, there can be a huge gap between the complexity of the instructions and the complexity of the results those instructions produce. A few weeks ago, in the essay, Why is Complexity So Complex?, I mentioned algorithmic complexity. It's a way of measuring complexity by measuring how much information it takes to describe something. The set of instructions for Rule 110 has very low algorithmic complexity. You can write those instructions in just a few lines of code. But let the instructions run for a while and the complexity explodes. So if the set of instructions doesn't contain much information, and if we can start from something simple and still get something astonishingly complex, where does the rest of the complexity come from? We don't get complexity simply because the set of instructions exist. We need to run it. And to run it, two things are essential. Time, because the pattern evolves one step at a time. Complexity doesn't appear all at once, it unfolds. And energy, because each computational step requires it. Without energy, the system sits still. So the complexity in outcome Rule 110, or the game of life, doesn't come from the code alone. It comes from code plus time plus energy. This is how a cellular automation grows. But is it how a brain grows? Question 3. What does it mean to grow a brain? We've seen that a system like Rule 110 grows complexity through just 3 things: code, plus time, plus energy. So what about a brain? A brain also grows through code. We call that DNA. And time, we call that development. And energy, in the form of nutrients. So far, the story sounds similar, but there is a key difference. Cellular automata, like Rule 110, always produce the same outcome. If we start from the same starting point, we will always get the same outcome, every time. Life doesn't work that way. If life were just code plus time plus energy, then every organism with the same DNA would be identical. Every identical twin would have the same brain, the same personality, and the same preferences. But that's not what we see. Identical twins aren't really identical. So something else must be going on. Let's focus on the code for life, DNA. All currently known living things have DNA. We might imagine that DNA is a kind of program, similar to the rule for a cellular automation. It's code, it's fixed, and it tells cells what to do. But it turns out that DNA is far more dynamic than people usually assume. It's true that DNA, the A, T, C, and G bases in your cells, is largely fixed from the moment of conception. It's also true that most of your body's cells carry the same core DNA. This stability is essential. It allows cells to reliably build proteins and keep the body running. But DNA doesn't behave like the static code we find in cellular automata. Let's imagine the cells in the body as the cells in a cellular automation. In a cellular automation, the same rules apply to every cell equally, regardless of where the cell is located or when the rule is used. But in biology, that's not what happens. Each cell applies a slightly different rule, depending on where it is, what stage of development it is in, and what its neighbours are doing. The code doesn't run uniformly. It adapts locally, and constantly. The rules that are applied are constantly changing. Imagine a newly divided cell. Let's anthropomorphize it and call her Zelda. Where Zelda ends up in the body will shape her future. If she lands near the developing gut, she will encounter different chemical signals than if she ends up near the skin. The cells around her release proteins that influence which genes Zelda turns on and off. Genes are small stretches of DNA that tell the cell how to make specific proteins. You can think of them as biological instructions. Basically, these signals tell her which instructions to follow, which genes to turn on and off. In response, Zelda begins producing her own proteins, which then influence how her neighbors behave and which rules they apply in turn. It's a feedback loop. This turning on and off of genes is known as gene regulation, and it's shaped by everything from developmental timing to diet, stress, sleep, and exposure to toxins. Cells regulate genes based on local signals, and those signals ripple through the body, triggering new patterns of gene expression as the system grows and reorganizes itself. And this process doesn't stop when we're fully grown. Gene regulation continues throughout our life. So, like a cellular automation, DNA doesn't give us the finished blueprint. It gives us a starting state and a set of rules for how things interact. But unlike cellular automation, the way the rules are applied changes. Which genes are used, which part of the code is read, and when depends entirely on the cell's environment, its location, its neighbors, and its history. DNA is code, but it's not code in the way most software runs code. It's not a fixed program. It doesn't execute sequentially. And it adapts and responds while it grows, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to reverse engineer. This is how we grow a brain. Not by following a rigid blueprint, but by running a responsive process, one that unfolds over time. It changes as it goes, and it adapts to its context and learns from the inside out. So, why do we grow brains this way? Why grow them through adaptation and feedback instead of building them following a fixed set of instructions? Because the world is unpredictable, and life has to survive in that unpredictable world. Building a biological brain, a real thinking, learning brain, means building one that can deal with that unpredictability. A rigid, unchanging set of instructions wouldn't survive long in an environment full of variation, danger, and surprise. Life doesn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolds in a shifting world of varying light, temperature, nutrients, stress, and noise. A one-size-fits-all solution would break the moment conditions changed. Instead of hard-coding every outcome or relying on a fixed set of rules like cellular automation, evolution found a better strategy: flexibility. By giving cells the ability to turn genes on and off, to sense, respond, and adapt, organisms become more resilient. They can not only grow in different environments, they can adapt their behavior based on experience. A body that can regulate its own genes is more than just a machine following a script or an algorithm. It's a system that changes itself. Is this what differentiates life from cellular automation? Life doesn't just grow. It adapts and changes itself. That might be the real dividing line, not between code and non-code, but between systems that are changed and systems that change themselves. As we build more advanced AI, systems that learn, adapt, and reshape themselves in response to the world, that distinction seems to be starting to blur. If a machine starts to change itself the way life does, adapting, responding, reorganizing to survive and thrive, is it still something we built? That's an interesting question. But life adapts because it has to, because survival depends on it. The drive to grow, respond, and reorganize comes from within. It's not an optional upgrade. It's a condition for continued existence, not just for the individual, but for the species. Only a few years ago, we would have claimed that AI doesn't grow like this. And for the most part, that's still true. Most AI changes because we tell it to. When we supply new data, tweak a loss function, or modify its architecture, the motivation, timing, and direction of change still comes largely from the outside, or us, at least for now. But some researchers are building systems that might change that, models that can learn continuously, reshape themselves, and even set their own goals. And in some experimental cases, AI does begin to unfold in surprising, self-organizing ways. But there's still a whole lot of scaffolding involved. These systems don't grow in the wild, they grow in the lab. And even when these systems adapt, it's not quite what living systems do. In biology, growth and learning aren't separate. A brain doesn't get built and then start adapting. It adapts as it builds. The system shapes itself while figuring out how to function. That's because the instructions for growth, DNA, are embedded inside the very cells doing the growing. There is no separation between the thing being changed and the thing doing the changing. The code is in the system, and the system rewrites itself. And these changes aren't completely random. They're shaped by interaction with the environment, the body, and the system's own history. The system doesn't just change, it changes in ways that make sense for its environment, its body, and its goals. So maybe the more interesting questions are, would a neural network ever need to grow like that? Could it grow like that? I'll leave those questions with you. I would really love to know what you think.